It's great to be here. Ever since I can remember, from a very young kid, I've been surrounded by the fire service and firefighters. It's what my family did, still do. My father, my late father, he was a firefighter. My brother's a firefighter. My grandfather's a firefighter. My cousin's a firefighter. And so I grew up in fire stations. It's the only memories I have. Going to the Christmas party, going to pancake dinners, going to parades, but never been to a fire, or at least not until later in my life. One of my earliest memories is when I was about 10 years old. I was with my father, who at the time was a volunteer fire chief, and he was in his bright, shiny, yellow, new chief car, which was a cool thing back then. It was like a new, prestigious thing that he was the only fire chief in the county that had a chief car. And we were going to the hardware store to get something I grew up in a small, little 200-year-old schoolhouse, or farmhouse, and so we had to get something. I forget what it was. So I was excited. I was 10. I'm riding with my father in this cool chief car, and I can remember like the radio with the scanner with the red lights, and the older people here in the room might remember, and it would scan back and forth, and when there was a transmission, it would stop. And I don't remember what they were talking about, right? Except this one time it stopped, and there was some sort of transmission that I really couldn't make sense of. But what I knew after that is it was something not good, because my father turned the siren on and the lights, and we were speeding somewhere. And so I was sort of excited. On one hand, I'm 10 years old, and I'm like, wow, like something, there's this emergency. And I see my father in a whole new light, and we're speeding along these country road. And then the sirens wailing, my heart rate got up. And I was 10. I was a little bit scared. I was excited. I'm not really sure what those feelings were. And I remember we came over this small rise, and there was a building, a one-story building, and I now know, was a nursing home. At the time, I didn't know. I was 10. And we were the first ones there. So I remember watching. I get out of the vehicle, and I can feel the cold, crisp air in my lungs. I could smell wood burning, and it reminded me of the smell when I used to climb in the hose bed with the hose, that burnt smell. I remember that to this day. I could see the smoke roaring from this building. You could even hear the crackling of the wood. And I'm little now, but I was littler then. And I was standing there sort of in awe of what was happening. And my father was on the radio. Who knows what he was doing, right? And it seemed a few minutes later, the first engine arrives, and there are people I recognize from the fire station. And on the back step were 3 young firefighters who I recognized. And it was one of these old front mount open cab fire trucks. It was a gasoline Ford, and it had a really bad exhaust manifold. So when it roared, it basically roared in there, and they put on the brakes. And so I'm watching them, as I always watch them on Wednesdays. They would do drills. So I see them doing what I knew at the time what firefighters do. I saw them pulling a hose, and then I remember, my father telling them to stop, doing what they always do. And as I recall, he tells them there's not time. And so they drop the hose that they had started to pull, the attack line, and they grab some tools. And as they run by me, I can hear their labored breath. I can see in their eyes, not sure if it was fear, confidence, but certainly willful acceptance that they were going to do something a little bit different. And they all run into this burning building. And I'm left there, standing next to this chief car in this old fire truck, and I was 10 years old. And it was silence, and I could see the smoke. And I wondered, wow, seemed like an eternity, and it was probably a few minutes, but it seemed like an eternity for me at the time. The second engine comes in, and there's several more firefighters on there, and they do exactly what I'm used to. They began to, now, they laddered the roof, and they pulled an attack line, and they did some other things. And they attacked the fire. All of this transpired in a very short period of time, as I recall, but for me as a young child, it was a long time. And it was the first time that I got to see what you all do, what my family did as a tradition, like firefighting. It was the first time that I actually, because all of those times in the fire stations around as my youth, I never actually got to see a fire. I never actually got to go and experience even a little bit of what it might be like for you in your day-to-day life. So the question, what if I were to tell you that this was 1978, right? So this is when, shortly before that, 5 years before, the America is Burning study came out. 12,000 people were dying from fires every year in the 70s. The number's a lot lower today. What if I were to tell you that those three young men, and they were really teenagers, to me they seemed old at the time, right? All of them rose to be chief officers, paid chief officers in departments around the state of Maryland. And so now as an adult, I look back at this and I ask the question to myself, why did they do what they did? Why were they even there? And on that specific day, why did they trust in the leader and then do something that was not really what they normally did? And they were willing to adapt to that circumstance, right? My goal today is to try to help interpret what I think I experienced that day, explain it to you in some other ways related to my own experience as a Marine Corps leader, so that it can benefit you and the department here. So what I would like to do first is we're going to talk about the world as it is today, because I think it's important for all of you to see the world differently than you think it is. And I think that COVID is one of those recent examples where how we thought the world really worked and behaved sort of was disrupted when this thing COVID happened, right? It changed all of our lives, both professionally, personally. For my own family, my wife is very much a think-in-the-box person, and it disrupted this idea that life is predictable. If I do all the right things will happen. And then, wow, I'm not really in control of anything. How many of you felt that way? Anybody? So what I hope to do today is to talk a little bit about what you can control, what you can't control, how that relates to culture, how that relates to leadership. But first, let's talk about seeing the world differently. So change that you perceive as happening is accelerating. So it isn't just because we're connected by smart devices today and you can perceive the change. No kidding, the amount of change politically, socially, ecologically, financially, whatever domain you want to analyze, the amount of change is increasing. More importantly, the pace of change is accelerating. That isn't something that you just feel, that is reality. So what does that mean for all of us? It has consequences on how we view ourselves, the world, and how we view ourselves in that world. And from a professional perspective, what does that mean for your department, how you operate as a battalion, how you operate at the company level or as an individual firefighter, EMT, or whatever that may be? It's going to change. If you have 20 years in the department, I know each of you could reflect and say, how much has changed since when I joined versus now? Without placing any value judgment on good or bad. The department that you all are joining right now will be very different 20 years from now. The district, in many ways, will be exactly the same, and at the very exact same time, very different. At the same exact time, there is this idea of incongruence that's in the real world. So on this slide, I have a list, and I don't generally use bullets, but I'm doing it for this presentation so that if anybody wanted to take notes, particularly the young people who are just joining. So there are infinite number of variables that shape the world that you live in every day. And there are those, and you'll see it on the internet, like, hey, there's big data, and there's AI, and there's machine learning. Make no mistake, those things are changing our world, but they're not going to reduce uncertainty. There are still variables you're never going to be able to discover. There's a thing called unknown unknowns, right? That's a real thing. So no matter how much data, how much computing power, how much data-driven decisions you want to have, there are still things that are at play that affect your world Therefore, you have to consider those as leaders, okay? If you fall into the category of, hey, I think I kind of know all the variables, therefore I can have some algorithm to give me the answer, I would argue you're wrong. And you are going to accrue risk, and then at some point there's going to be a catastrophic failure. Hopefully not on the fire ground, right? 9/11 is a good example of that, right? After the United States was attacked, more than 20 years ago, the government, as they always do when there's a major government failure, did a study, and they did the 9/11 Commission, and they said we should have known all these things. I think that that's hooey. No. You can know all these things in retrospect. In foresight, it always is a lot different. And so I want you to recognize that as you are contemplating your day-to-day shift, whether you're an organizational leader and you think a little bit longer, or in your own personal life. It's important, I think, for you to recognize the world we actually live in is very different. How many of you remember before the iPhone? Right? I mean, is it easy to remember? I mean, today, if I'm going to go run errands, my wife's like, she doesn't need to really ask me when I'm going to be back or where I'm going because she can track my phone. She knows where I'm at. She knows what place. When I was a kid, it was like go outside and come back when it's dark, right? Like you rode your bike and, no one knew where the heck you were. Now we feel like, oh my God, my cell phone connection, I lost it and I can't make a call instantaneously. Like life's not going to end, right? Sometimes being disconnected might actually be a good thing. All of that, more information is not necessarily better, right? Those of you who are decision makers on the fire ground, more information, quality information matters. A whole bunch of noise is not useful, right? And you all learn how to sift through all of that. So there's this thing called complexity, and I'm not going to get into great detail in this presentation today about this. Complexity theory explains this idea that there are unknown variables at play, and the way in which they interact create new behaviors that are not predictable, okay? But what we can do is we can create regularity within that system, and that's what culture does. That's what identity does. That's what organizational structure does. It brings some semblance of regularity, some semblance of predictability to the world that we live in, okay? But don't be over-reliant on that, meaning don't believe that that's permanent. Everything is temporal in the human world. Everything you see in this room is human created. Therefore, humans can unmake it. Like it's not permanent, right? And so I think it's important for us to recognize that. Let me see if I can get this thing to work. So why do you think, so I don't want you to answer out loud, but I want you to think about why do you think you personally are slow to change, unwilling to change, don't want to change? Think about that for a minute. I'll give you my answer. Change is hard. Like, why do I want to change something? I already know how to do this thing. Why do I want to relearn, do something else, right? Think about how that applies to your profession, your experience as a firefighter. You learned one way, and it's worked at 1,000 fires. Why do I need to change it now? Well, maybe there's new information that tells you were just really lucky in those 1,000 fires. Or there's some other variables that you've now discovered, right? And so it's important for us to recognize that there are reasons. At the organizational level, I would offer that most of the management theory, and so how many of the chiefs in here have been executive fire officer, or, all those different programs are out there? Yeah. So I've spoken at the National Fire Academy. I was not invited back because I went to Emmitsburg a couple years ago for the executive fire officer program. And so there was a bunch of chiefs from prestigious departments like your own from across the country, and it was great. And I was like a speaker on the second day, and I'm like, this is not going to go well because I'm going to basically say everything that those guys said I disagree with. And there were some who were receptive, but it was probably 50-50. But I left shortly thereafter because I did not feel very comfortable because the environment changed a little bit. I do not believe, based on my academic research and my own experience, that the dated management theory of the 50s that has permeated government organizations is the most effective way to lead in the 21st century. What I mean by that is you are a hierarchical organization. There is a chief and there is structure. But it can't be the chief at the pinnacle has all the answers and he or she dictate the solution to everybody. There was a time where, in theory, the chief was the most experienced person and they really were in the best position to do that, right? But that is not the case we live in today. No one person can have all the expertise, knowledge, and experience to do that, right? And in fact, many of the youngest members of your department might be more technologically fluent than you. They might understand things differently than you because you're resistant to change because the world's changed, but maybe you haven't. But the world they grew up in is different than the world that you grew up in or that I grew up in, right? My 17-year-old daughter has never been taught how to use any technology. She just magically just knows how to use stuff. Like my wife has to watch, and I watch YouTube videos to figure out how to do some things. And my daughter's like, what are y'all doing? You just do this? And I'm like, how do you know that? And she's like, I don't know, I just know, right? Same thing for your profession, right? And so think about that a little bit. So I have up here on the slide this misapplied management theory. Because the management theory says if I write a policy that says all firefighters shall do X, Y, and Z, we don't have a problem. Because I wrote a policy, chief. Like I signed it, I distributed it, all the company officers said they received it and they posted it, so we're good. Not really, right? Not really. Think about, one of the better examples is, think about like computer access, right? You all probably have to sign some user agreement because you're going to be on the DC Fire Department email system, or like I did a lot of federal work, right? So I had to sign a thing. And then all the cybersecurity people were like, hey, we're good. Like, there's a policy. You're not supposed to stick a thumb drive into the secret computer because there might be a virus. So we're good. And there's every year someone sticks a thumb drive with a virus unintendedly into the wrong system and it crashes the system. And they're like, we can't figure out why. We have a policy. Well, because the policy is not people. Like your organization is made up of people. It's not made up of policies and a wiring diagram, right? It's made up of people, and people have choices. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later this morning, about individual agency, right, and how that plays. Because you can have a policy. You could be maybe I'm a captain, or way back when you were a lieutenant and I was a brand new firefighter, and you have some rules. I still get to choose whether I follow the rules. There's consequences, maybe not. We'll talk about that too. Because if the complaint process takes 6 months, not really, that's not going to change my behavior, right? So we'll come back to that though. So here's the notional department, right? You got this wiring diagram and the chief's at the top, and right? Does that diagram explain how your department behaves, why it behaves that way, why it functions that way? Can you explain day-to-day business off of this chart? Anybody say yes? You can raise your hand. Okay, that's a good answer. I don't agree, but that's a good answer. It begins because we do need structure, right? No doubt. So trust me, I'm a very non-structured guy, even as a United States Marine, but you got to have structure. But each of those boxes actually comprises people, right? There's people in those. Those boxes represent ideas that are in people's head, right? And those ideas have to be manifested in the way that people interact and behave. And some people are responsible for certain functions. Some people have authority over other individuals and can direct people to do things, right? But here's how I want you to think about your organization. That's how it actually works. Now, it's a very simple graph, right? But my point is that it's not the individual in this little yellow box doesn't have to, they can call this person. Now, paperwork-wise and workflow, it has to go up and over, and people have to approve stuff. I get all that. But in reality, they can pick up the phone. Like, they're allowed to speak to the other human that's in a different part of the structure, right? Anybody agree with that? Right? So if I'm in, I don't know, engine company, whatever, in the district, and I'm a firefighter, maybe my cousin's a lieutenant in a different engine company somewhere else in the department. I can talk to he or she, right? Like, I don't have to get permission. Like, those interactions actually happen. Those interactions do shape how your department functions informally, right? I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm not placing a value judgment on it. I'm just saying unless we think about it, we think that on the left is exactly how we're taught that it works. And it works that way partly, but there's also this on the right. And I need you to understand that that exists. That's not on a wiring diagram anymore, right? If I were a new firefighter and in a department and my relative or a close family friend were the chief or a very senior person and there was a new policy being instituted, I'm pretty sure that at Sunday dinner that chief is going to be like, hey, Charlie, how's that really being received down there? That's not on the wiring diagram. The fire chief's not supposed to be talking directly to a firefighter at the lower end of the thing on a routine basis, right? But that's just an example, right? But that can happen at any level. And so I use that. I remember in 1992, I was a second lieutenant. I was stationed at Quantico, Virginia, going through some of my initial training. And at the time, the Commandant of the Marine Corps was General Charles Krulak. Happens to be about the same stature as me, interestingly enough. And it was like 4:30 in the morning, and we were getting ready to go prepare our equipment to go out and do like 6 days of training out in the woods and run around and do all that kind of stuff. And as a second lieutenant, a captain is like there's a big gap in terms of authority and positional experience and all of that. Above a captain, you don't even want to talk to those people, like a colonel or something. You don't want to make eye contact. You just trying not to be seen because, you're just trying not to be the slowest runner at that point, right? So there I am in the barracks, and we have all of our equipment. We're walking out, and then here's this 4-star general, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, is at our barracks at 4:30 in the morning. He doesn't have an aide with him. There's no escort. No one knew he was coming because he wanted to see what was actually happening at the bottom end of that wiring diagram. And so he became, let me go see that little part of that little graph right there. Let's see what's going on there. So I plant that seed for you, and I'll come back to this as we progress this morning. So what is this thing that we call leadership? What is it really? There's a lot of definitions. It includes management and management of resources and time and material and those sorts of things, but it's much more than management. And I personally struggle with, I work in the business sector and I do advising to medium-sized corporations. And I struggle when I interact with CEOs that have prestigious degrees from like Harvard MBA and they've been a CEO for 30 years. And I have to tell them that I think you're full of shit. I don't think you know what leadership really is. But how many of you, if you can't describe it, how many of you know what it is when you experience it? Because I do, right? Or you know that it's not leadership. How many of us experience that, right? But it can be both of those at the same time. That same individual that you experience not leadership and could have come from the same person under different circumstances, right? It's not like he or she is a leader, he or she's not a leader. I mean, I wish it were that simple. Some people are innately born with certain characteristics that might make it easier for them, but others have to work at it. But leaders can be developed. Leaders can be, I would use, cultivated. And there are certain attributes. Some individuals don't want to be a leader. Nothing wrong with that. And we're going to come back to that because they really are, whether they think they are or not, right? So what's it look like and who are these leaders? Do you all have, either in the academy or in training, do you all talk about leadership specifically? You do? Okay. Is there a leadership development program?
Yes.
For what level?
So, yeah, I'm sorry. Everyone.
Oh, them too?
Initially, yes.
Awesome. Do you all feel like you're getting leadership training?
Not yet.
He's not looking. He's not looking. You can look. So this leadership thing, I mean, if you go to a bookstore, right, there's probably like 500 books on leadership. And then go to the back of the book and read the part about like the author. And then you realize this dude hadn't done anything. Like what the hell are they talking about? Because theory is one thing, practice is another. Now, I would tell you I'm an aspiring leader. That's my goal. Like, I aspire to be a leader. Sometimes I am. Sometimes I'm the dude who sucks at that, right? Whether that be setting an example and leading within my family, among my friends, or in a professional role. As a Marine officer, well, I'll go back to when I went to Parris Island in 1986. So that dates me a little bit, but you know, there was still the Cold War and the Soviet Union and all that kind of stuff. So I joined to fight communism, right? Like, I want to kill commies. So I went to Parris Island, South Carolina, and I had always wanted to be a Marine. And for whatever reason, after that experience the story I told you, I did not choose firefighter, only to spite my father, who I was named after. And I sort of regret that because I was the only one in the family who didn't do that. But I went to Parris Island. I earned the title Marine. And one of the things I learned at Parris Island is I remember one morning when you're at recruit training, they have a thing called fire watch. And so you all like this. So in the military, there's always someone awake to make sure to sound the alarm. And they call it fire watch, except when you're in combat, we call it something else, but it's essentially the same thing. There is one or two people awake, and their job is to protect everyone else and to overwatch them while they sleep, rest, whatever that might be. So I'm in an open squad bay with 80 other young men from around the country at Parris Island. It was like August of 1986. It was hot, sand fleas, there's no air condition, none of that. They got wool blankets, doesn't make a lot of sense. So you had like white sheets of wool blankets, and it's like, 90 degrees. And I was on fire watch, and I had watch from 02 to 04, which just sucks, right? Because by the time you get to sleep, you're awake, and then you never get to go back to sleep. So that night, you're like toast. So myself and another young recruit are on fire watch. And so you like walk around, and every once in a while, senior drill instructors or sometimes an officer would come into the squad bay late at night to check, to inspect, to make sure that the fire watch, there is one, and that you're doing what you're supposed to do. Because you're a new recruit. You're trying to instill, just like with these firefighters, what is expected of you, right? Because certainly falling asleep in combat, like, someone's going to beat your ass if you survive that whole incident. Because people's lives are at risk, right? So this is a pretty important thing. So I remember we had to keep track of all the rifles, and they just hung on the end of the bunk beds. They weren't locked. They're just fully automatic M16s like hanging there, and you had to keep track of how many there were. So when you came in, I had to report, like, recruit black reports, 80 recruits and 80 rifles all accounted for. But then one wasn't, right? And because the other person on fire watch with me, I wasn't paying attention. He had taken his rifle and gone into the bathroom where there's lights and was cleaning his rifle. So right next to me was his bunk, and there was clearly not a rifle. And so I remember this lesson from this visit, and I remember that gunnery sergeant telling me, instead of chewing my butt, plus he would have woken everybody up, he said, if there's two Marines, one's always in charge. And he's like, which one of you's in charge? Because he was trying to figure out, is he going to yell at me or is he going to yell at the guy who went in the bathroom? So me, aspiring leader, I'm like, Gunny, I'm in charge. And so then he commenced, to lay into me pretty good. So I remember this lesson that if there's two individuals, one's a leader, somebody's in charge, somebody's responsible, whether they put you in a formal position or not, right? The worst thing to be is to be apathetic and do nothing, right? And unfortunately, we see this a lot. in our society today where there's crimes and people do nothing. And it's really difficult for me to wrap my brain around how people can walk by a crime in action, and particularly when young people are being hurt or women are being assaulted and no one does anything, right? But these stories are the same. It's about leadership, right? So here's a pretty funny, those of you in leadership or formal or informal, here's a graphic that I like to use, right? So we think it looks like the thing on the left, but those that have experienced leadership, it really is the thing on the right? Anybody experience that?
Yes.
You the only one, Chief? Like, come on.
The only one talking, I think.
I know, you're not allowed to talk anymore. So, and why do you think that I show you this graphic? If you agree that this is what leadership feels like, why do you think I show you this? Any thoughts?
To normalize it because it's true.
Is it okay that things are like crazy? Like if you want everything to be neat and ordered and stuff, like you got to get another job, right? Nothing is going to happen the way you think it's going to happen, right? I mean, how many of you have showed up for a shift and you're feeling confident, your crew's been good with everything, and then that day something wacky happens, right? And things just, no matter what you do, things never turn out exactly the way you wanted. Anybody ever experience that? I'd say that's like half of my days. So I have like no expectations half the time. Like I'm like, if I don't have any expectations, I won't feel this because this isn't fun to feel, right? But the real point is accept that that's okay. Like it's normal for the graphic on the right. That's normal. So don't have this this why I was poo-pooing the management theory, because they make you believe, well, no, you're just missing some things. If you do X, Y, and Z, then it will feel like the thing on the left. But that's not really true, right? And it's probably somewhere in between, right? I mean, I'm purposely drawing stark contrast here for the purposes of this. So I offer, whether it's one of the brand new recruits or cadet, is it cadets? Recruits, okay. One of you, whether it's one of you or one of the more senior chiefs in here, your purpose is leadership. The outcome of that is successful firefighting, emergency services, and all those other things. But your real purpose is leadership. If you focus as much of your time on developing and cultivating your leadership, and we're going into great detail on this, as you do to the technical skill of, stretching a line, forcing a door, whatever, in equal amount, then you will be woefully successful and so will the people around you. If you do not, then you're not reaching your potential and you're certainly not helping the people around you reach theirs, right? And all of us, as a human species, are meaning-seeking people. Like that's what, all the way back to the cavemen, to now. Humans as a species, Homo sapiens, are meaning-seeking species. There's no other species on this planet. Only the 8 billion people that live here seek purpose and meaning and try to interpret life. Every other species is just trying to survive. They are living in the moment, okay? They don't think about retirement. They're not thinking about kids. They're not thinking about culture. No, we're the only ones. And so if that's true, if you buy into that, then your purpose is leadership because you get to interact in some way with that big ecosystem of humans that live on this earth. Think about it, 8 billion people, right? So in the top, I don't know if you can you all see the picture on the bottom? So that is a picture of now retired Sergeant Major Castle. I think this was the battle of, I think it was in Fallujah. And he was a company first sergeant. So he happened to be an infantry Marine, but in the Marine Corps, the first sergeant is the senior enlisted in a rifle company. A rifle company is about 120 Marines, right? So it's led by a captain, and he's got a first sergeant. And the first sergeant does a lot of administrative duties. In a leader, but not necessarily a tactical combat leader, depending on what their background is, because not all first sergeants have to have come from the infantry to be in an infantry unit. Sergeant Major Castle And there was, during the Battle of Fallujah, a lot of house-to-house, room-to-room fighting. Very up-close interpersonal violence, taking of human life, and things that humans shouldn't have to do to one another, right? But because of culture and leadership, some Marines went into a building to clear, and it didn't go well. A lot of shooting. And I'm talking about closer from here to that door back there, right? Life and death is closer than that. He's safe, they're not. So he goes in with a pistol. He didn't even have an M16. An M9 pistol is like not the thing that is like my primary weapon when I've been in combat, because it's not that effective, okay, to be quite honest. But he, no question, went in to help his fellow Marines. And he was wounded, he killed some enemy, and then this is, I should have maybe used a color graphic, and he was helped carried out, he almost bled out, he was shot several times, later received the Navy Cross, which is the second highest decoration in the military right after the Medal of Honor. Should have gotten the Medal of Honor in my opinion. But I show you this because here's an individual who's not in the tactical leadership role of leading a specific unit, is observing, sees something, and then takes the initiative to act, right, and makes a difference in the lives of those very young Marines, who then in that picture, they carry him out. To me, that isn't a lot different than the photo at the top. Yeah, there's an enemy who's trying to kill you, but I'm talking about esoterically, when you arrive to a working fire and you're gonna go in and do an interior attack or whatever that might be, you're a small team and you're working together, and there's a similar, not the same, but a similar dynamic that's at play. And this is a thing called leadership, right? It goes back to my question of my story. Why did those firefighters do what they did? Why were they willing to drop the hose line and just run in to rescue some people? It seems like, yeah, I read it in the book and that's what you're supposed to do, but like doing it in practice is a whole other thing. They didn't have 10 years experience as firefighters. They were very new. In fact, most of them had less than 2 years as a volunteer fireman. So nowhere near the experience that you have in this room, right? Why did they do that, right? Why did Castle do that, right? So for me, leadership is about culture making, okay? Leadership is not me telling you what to do, okay? I mean, that's, young leaders tend to think it's about being the boss, right? And there is some of that, right? You do have to direct people. You do have to enforce regulations. You have to give people tasks, right? You hold them accountable. You do all those things. But more importantly, beyond the moment, I believe that leadership is about cultivating, creating, making, and remaking culture. And what I mean by culture is the norms of the social group and what is the expected behavior, whether it's in a policy memo or not. And I imagine if I interviewed all of you and I did a whole bunch of survey data and did a whole bunch of stuff, I could discover that there's a bunch of things that are formalized, but there's a lot of things that shape the behavior of your department that aren't written down anywhere. But everybody sort of knows what those things are. Maybe you don't yet, but when you get to your first company, you'll eventually learn those things, right? Do you all agree with that? So we'll talk about this later. Do you think that you measure, evaluate, or value those things for promotion, for assignments? I already know the answer in my own external opinion. And the question is, why or why not? Right? It goes back to my graphic of the wiring diagram versus the little network graph, right? I want you to think in networks, not necessarily in hierarchy. So for me, I've taught leadership. Again, I am not an expert, so I'm just going to be clear. I'm experienced, and I've made as many bad judgments as I've made good ones. I try to reflect on those. I'm a lifelong learner. I'm truly committed to trying to learn why did I make or you make certain decisions under what context, what could have been different, right? I do that. I'm a student, I'm a learner in that regard. And so, like I said, I'm going to try to explain and interpret and share some of my experiences that will benefit you. But you can take some of it, all of it, because I'm not going to ever use the word expert because I think that that's a fallacy. I don't think there's anything as a leadership expert per se, right? I'm a practitioner of leadership. So for me, when I'm asked, hey, Charlie, what is leadership? I think leadership is influence, right, that does 4 things, okay? The first is to inspire. So as a young Marine officer, when I got my first infantry platoon, I was 24 years old. Most of my Marines were 18 or 19 years old. So the age difference is sort of like big brother, little brother, right? There's not a big gap, right? You have this platoon of young men, now in some cases women, but at the time just men, from all over the United States. Almost every major city, rural area, poor, rich. I mean, I had one kid in my platoon who had a PhD from Yale in like Eastern philosophy, and he was a Lance Corporal, right? I had another kid who truly from a broken home and very poor and was using this to escape wherever his family lived to try to get a better life, right? But all together in one group, right? So all of this division that's today, I didn't experience that as a Marine. There was fights sometimes among them, but they worked it out because their shared hardship together and doing things together, they were able to bridge those differences and value the differences, but they had a common identity of, I'm a Marine, right? And if I'm a Marine, therefore I'm a leader, because if there's 2 Marines, one's in charge, right? And then they're arguing over who's in charge. That's a good thing. Like, hey, I'm going to leave you 2 to do this. Which one of you is in charge? And if you both stare at each other, like, then I'm usually pretty upset as the more senior leader. I'm like, you all should be fighting to be in charge, right? I mean, that's a Marine Corps thing. So first is to inspire. So I was fortunate that I had prior enlisted experience and very limited combat experience when I became a platoon commander. I went to the Gulf War. You know, the war lasted like 2 days. Seemed very traumatic at the time. Compared to my later combat experience, was not as bad as I had originally perceived it to be. But, so I'm in front of my infantry platoon. Some of them have done multiple deployments to places I haven't been. They've experienced things I haven't experienced. But I'm the leader, I'm the formal leader. But there were among my group Marines who I identified that, wow, like that Lance Corporal, who's not even a non-commissioned officer, influences half of my platoon in a very positive way. Like I saw that pretty quickly because he inspired the other members to suck it up when it was raining, it was cold, we're doing something physically difficult because you hike under a lot of load, kind of like you all doing stairs, wearing all your equipment, but imagine doing that for like a week, nonstop, right? And no shower and no food and shit like that, right? And you as the platoon commander aren't going to be like, hey, suck it up. You don't say anything. Like you let the subordinates kind of, so you'll be bitching about something and then he'll tell you to shut the hell up and, all this stuff's happening. And then there's one who's inspiring. Like, hey, this is going to make us stronger. Like if we can do this in training, then we can do this in combat, right? So it was very inspirational, right? So I was like, wow, okay, I learned something. Even as a lieutenant, I was like, leadership is about inspiring. I tried to inspire my Marines. I could shoot better than them. I was more physically fit. Like the Marine Corps, your physical fitness test is a 3-mile run, and crazily, I smoked back then for like a 1-year period, and I could still run like 6-minute miles. I don't know how the hell you could do that. Maybe when you're 24 you can do anything. But so I can run faster, I can shoot faster. I had more technical knowledge. I mean, all I did was study. Like my wife's like, what are you doing? You're like off. And I'm like, I'm never off. Like this is my life. Like you're not sometimes a firefighter, you're always a firefighter. You might not be on duty, but you're always a firefighter, right? You can't take that out of you. Even if you quit the department today, you'll always be a firefighter. You're always going to be part of that graphic that I showed you, right? So inspirational, right? So that's one, influence that inspires. If I can get this damn thing. The second is to empower. This is the more difficult one. That means I'm the engine captain or I'm the infantry company commander. I have to allow you to do things. even if I think you're going to screw some of them up, right? That's hard to do because my promotion depends on my performance. And so it would just be easier for me to tell you exactly what to do because I already know the answer and just have you do that, right? And I train you to those skills. But then when I leave or in combat, I take one through the running lights, nobody knows how to do anything because there's no one to tell you what to do. You have all these skills, but you don't know how to do the problem solving. You don't know how to assign the tasks, right? That's a little bit harder, right? So as a young Marine lieutenant, my job is to work myself out of a job. I assumed, and I used to tell my platoon, assume that when we cross the line of departure, which is when you kick off an operation, assume that the lieutenant is going to get killed. What then? So who's going to take charge, right? Hopefully, the 3 squad leaders are arguing over who's going to be in charge. But one of them is going to be more inspirational. So going back to inspiration, one of them is going to be like, I want to be in charge, but I think you're more, I think you should be in charge, right? What a great thing. But empowering is difficult because you have to give up authority, formal authority. So I'm an engine captain, battalion chief, I'm an infantry company commander, it doesn't matter, right? I have to give up some of my authority and power and give it to you to use, and you get to test ride it. But I'm responsible for the mistakes you make, right? There's a trust factor there, right? I have to be humble enough. I have to take enough courage to allow you to do that. Because the only way you can learn and grow beyond the point that you got to is to exercise that power, test ride it, right? I mean, I'll go back to the Executive Fire Officer program at the National Fire Academy, which blows my mind. You can't go to that program until you're a chief officer. I mean, that doesn't make any goddamn sense at all. Like, why wouldn't you train people before they're in the position? Right? That would be like, hey, you're going to come to the academy after your first year riding on the engine. Like, that doesn't make any goddamn sense. But we do that when it comes to non-tangible skill, like leadership skills and management. We do that all the time. When it's technical, we're like, no, got to send him to driver school or got to send them to paramedic school. They got to take a test. But those are all easily measured things. Leadership is not so easily measured. There's all those infinite variables I told you about because you can be this awesome, inspirational leader who empowers your subordinates and still bad shit can happen. It's not your fault, per se, right? Okay, so the third thing is develop. Leadership is about developing, and that goes hand in hand with the empowerment, your subordinates, yourself, and most importantly, your peers. The most important people to you, I would offer, are your fellow firefighters that you're going through this academy with. Your peers and what they think of you as a firefighter is more important than the training captain or the training chief. Yeah, they're going to sign off and you're either going to graduate or not. But the most important thing is who judges whether you're a good firefighter? Is it your officer or is it your peers? Which one do you think? Peers? So when I was a young second lieutenant again in an infantry battalion, so there's about 1,000 Marines, there's 3 infantry companies with 4 lieutenants in each, right? So it's a relatively small cohort. And you're competing between companies, just like for prestige and who's better and all, it all makes you better. But if you saw a lieutenant in your unit who was not meeting the expectations, I mean, the Marine Corps eats their young. I mean, like 5 or 6 lieutenants will pull you aside and be like, hey, you're a dirtbag. Like, you're not living up to expectations. Your Marines deserve better. You're making all of us look bad. Like peer pressure is a significant driver of peer performance in a professional way. Not hazing, but like those people need to be told because they might have a crappy boss who isn't a good leader and you're too scared to tell them that they're not. Or you're exercising individual agency and you're not really listening to your boss because you don't respect he or she for whatever reason. So your peers are important. So developing, helping your peers how to do that, developing yourself, seeking self-improvement every day, right? And we're going to talk about this later about physically, mentally, and spiritual development of yourself as a leader and then how that reflects in culture and how you lead people. okay? And so even at age 55, I pursue everyday physical activity, way slower than I used to be, not as strong as I used to be, but I focus on other metrics, like what's my resting heart rate. I try to make sure that my wellness, I do the things that are necessary. When I was young, I would run with like 50-pound pack and boots, which is why I have disabilities now and I have bad ankles. And like, I didn't know, I was dumb, right? I was inspiring, but like I was dumb. I did a lot of dumb stuff. Right now I try to do smart things, right? So developing your subordinates, the empowerment thing is a temporal thing. The developing of self, others, wow, that's a lot of work. And nowhere in your job description does it really tell you to do that as a company officer. Like you do the evaluation once a year or whatever. You sort of enforce the regulations depending on, whatever. But no one is paying you. Nowhere in your job description does it say you are developing your subordinate firefighters into future company officers and developing them physically, mentally, and spiritually for the demands of the fire service. It doesn't say that in your job description. Should say that in your job description. You're in a profession which has normative ethical consequences. Okay, so the last one is to achieve. So if you do the inspire, empower, and develop, but they can't actually get shit done, then you still fail as a leader, right? In the end, if you do the first three, in the end, they can achieve things, whatever those things are. Those could be on the fire ground things. More importantly, those could be things in the station house when you're not at the emergency. Because what I see when I visit fire service around the United States is, in large measure, we do really good on the fire ground and everybody knows the rules and who's in charge. And then when you get back to the firehouse, things seem to like, sometimes it's different. I'm not sure why that is. I have a lot of suppositions about that. So leadership is influence that inspires, empowers, develops, and achieves.
If you're acting like a slob, you dress like a slob, I would expect that.
So what are some characteristics to do that, inspire, empower, develop, and achieve? What are some of the characteristics of a leader? Anybody? Like just give me some stuff. Okay, communicator, what else? So tell me, why? What's your, when you say vision, what do you, tell me, describe that for me.
Okay. Being able to,
that's hard, that's a hard word.
Being able to see something like,
what's that? Vulnerable? Okay.
Before it
what
actually
else?
happens and knowing what to do to create that or build that.
Okay, so when you say technical, give me an example. I mean, do all the officers in here have a vision for their company? So I'm not a firefighter. What's do the job mean? You mean technical is like I know how to put an attack line in employment? Is it forcing the door? It's like when you say technical, what do you mean? Is that what you mean? Like laddering, throwing the ladder the proper way? And so how's that different than tactical? Because you all said tactical too. You're being empowered, but you're like going. Oh, knowing how to use those tools, right, or way. Okay. What else? So, I like that. Okay, not what kind of knowledge? What else?
Humility.
Humility. All right. What's that mean? Because you all test for that, right? Like when you take the officer's exams, you all have to memorize a bunch of knowledge.
Act like you've been
right?
there before. Take the good with
wisdom.
the bad.
That's a big word.
Okay.
Okay, hold on. All right. I like wisdom. We're gonna talk about wisdom today, but what do you, when you use the word wisdom, what do you, like, help me understand what that is? What's the picture in your head when you say bravery?
Basically knowing that if anything goes wrong, everything all falls on you, so you're willing to take that chance and be that one person that controls everything.
Contextual.
around it.
So I'm gonna I agree with bravery. And so if we go back to this at the very beginning when I talked about complexity, I agree with you. I would offer to try to enlarge that is because we live in this world of variables, right? You've been to a lot of fires, but every fire is not like the last. Every fire is unique. Physical courage is. I've heard some firefighters like, oh, I've been to 1,000 fires, they're all the same. Like, you're full of shit. They're not the same. Really important. Like, what you did may have been the same. What you narrowly perceived may have been the same. But the reality is, if you're wise, you see that there's things that are different. You see the nuance. Now, how you attack it might be exactly the same. You might choose to do that. Right? In that hierarchy. Judgment. Okay. There was another word you used. And they have institutional authority and power. Why do I care about compassion? Oh. Compassion for what? For the people whose house is on fire, or for your fellow firefighters? Wow.
Yeah, you're gonna deal with a lot
That's not what
leadership
firefighters
role.
do.
You're gonna
They're
deal with a lot of
passionate.
criticism, a lot of different things, but you got to be able to stay focused on your
Okay,
vision
what do you mean
and
by
your
that?
mission.
Okay, so Lieutenant, criticism from who?
Your peers, everybody,
Okay.
anybody.
Okay, so that goes back to my thing about
Or,
why
you know,
change is
people
hard,
might not
right?
always agree with what
If
you're
you
doing
are
'cause they don't have
inculcated
the
with
same vision.
the characteristic that you're willing to change, right, and that's okay, then that's adaptability. That's a good trait to have,
But it's
right?
some other issues, right? We're
We're
gonna talk about
Oh, that's a
later
good one. I
why we
love-
think some
I
of
love
these things happen, because there's a.
There we go,
there's a
double
disconnect
dong.
of expectations. What people were told was gonna happen.
I
what
was
you
going to
told
use
them was gonna
JJ
be like
Bieber,
your
but
company, and then they get to firehouse.
yeah.
Like that's
So
right,
initiative-
but there's
go ahead.
ways to narrow that so
Listen,
that there's more.
Hmm.
From the,
that's a big one.
any other.
So listening at the emergency, when I'm the captain or the incident commander, I ain't got time always to debate tactics. But at the firehouse, after, lots of time to talk about that, right? So how you listen and what degree you're listening and who you're listening to is a very dynamic thing. It's not, well, I put in a complaint because the captain said, you know, listening was important and he didn't listen to me. Like, right, like, don't take things so black and white. The world's a gray space, but I think listening is great. All the way in the back.
Here, I'm gonna show you some of mine, and they're pretty similar to you.
Okay, so set example. Set example in what way?
I mean, the agency, or, you know, your views of leadership and making sure that, I mean, if you're acting like a slob, you dress like a slob.
Yeah.
I would expect that from your crew, from your, you know, you're kind of a reflection of them.
Okay, cool.
Have a vision.
A vision, man. Y'all in the same firehouse? So tell me what's your, when you say vision, what do you, tell me, describe that for me. It's hard, that's a hard word.
Being able to see something like before it actually happens and knowing what to do to create that or build that.
I agree 1,000%. That's really hard though, right? I mean, do all the officers in here have a vision for their company or part of, but you can't have like 33 different visions,
You can just prioritize them.
but they can't be incongruent with the chief's vision, right? There should be big in how is your vision, how are you contributing to that, right? Or you're not really inspiring, you're being empowered, but you're like going in like the wrong direction. Consistency. I like that one. All right. What else?
Humility.
Humility. All right. What's that mean? What's humility?
To like act like you've been there before. Take the good with the bad.
Okay.
Don't boast.
All right. Okay, let's go over here.
Bravery.
Bravery. What, okay, tell me what you, when you use that word, give me, what's the picture, not the words, what's the picture in your head when you say bravery?
If anything goes wrong, everything all falls on you, so you're willing to take that chance and be that one person.
Okay. So I'm gonna, I agree with bravery, but let's use the word courageous for a minute. Because what you just described is mental courage, meaning I am willing as the leader to do what I think is right, no matter what the consequences might be, right? Versus physical courage is like, you know, I ran into a burning building or whatever, right? Both are really, really important. Moral courage is more difficult because it's career ending for many people. Because if you stand on your values, there is consequences. Because not everybody in that hierarchy that I showed you may agree with you. And they have institutional authority and power, and you may not fit. Go ahead. Tough skin. I thought all y'all wear like protective stuff. Y'all got thick skin, right? You're talking about like your feelings and stuff?
Yeah, you're gonna deal with a lot, in the leadership, bro, you're gonna deal with a lot of criticism, a lot of different things, but you gotta be able to stay focused on your vision and your mission.
Okay, so Lieutenant Steele, criticism from who? Your firefighters?
Peers, everybody,
Okay,
anybody.
okay.
Or, you know, people might not always agree with what you're doing, because they don't have the same vision.
Yeah, it's always good when the brand new firefighter critiques the company officer on the fire ground. That's awesome, right? No, I'm kidding. Right? But it's some other issues, right? We're going to talk about later why we think some of those things happen, because there's a disconnect of expectations. What people were told was going to happen, what you told them it's going to be like at the company, and then they get to the firehouse and it's completely different. And then they're like, whoa, that's not what they said, like, right? Like that's life, but there's ways to narrow that so that there's more homogeneous. Any other? What's that? Oh, okay. Yeah, I like all of them. Anybody else? Organization in what way? Like knowing what the tasks are and shit? Yeah, that's kind of important. Okay.
Pair a lot of those words, so like with consistency, you need flexibility.
Okay. All right, so this is a pretty good list. It doesn't need to be an inclusive list, so I'll leave this on the board. So I'll show you, here I'm going to show you some of mine, and they're pretty similar to yours. Humble, right? I will admit, and you all should recognize this, at least the new company officers, lieutenants, captains. It's a pretty big difference when you're firefighter or even acting officer, and now you're no shit a lieutenant. Is that different? Was that a big jump for you all? Because you're like, when you go from firefighter to company officer, like you're no kidding, now a company officer. Like, yeah, you've ridden in the right seat, you know, on some shifts or whatever, but like no shit, like you're now the lieutenant or the captain. That's a pretty big shift. I would relate that to being my experience as an enlisted Marine to becoming a commissioned officer. Neither is more important than the other, just different roles. And it was a difficult shift for me. And because I was trying to be inspirational and empower and trying to be a good leader, right? You know, I was a lunatic as a second lieutenant. Like I was fanatical. I still am fanatical about being a Marine. But I was really fanatical then about being a Marine. And how that translated to the people around you matters. I would say that there's a fine line between confidence and arrogance, right? I didn't always know where that line was as a young leader. And I would offer that I likely was on the arrogant side because I was really good. I'll be honest, like as a second lieutenant, I mean, I had everybody in my chain of command all the way up to the battalion commander. Like I was like this rock star. So I'm like, hell yeah, I'm a rock star. Like, but that shit goes to your head. And then guess what? My peers were like, hey dude, like you are really good, but you're an ass. Like you're not doing some of these other things, right? So it took the battalion chaplain, who was, and I'm Protestant, he was a Catholic priest. He had been a Green Beret in Vietnam. He had more combat decorations than anybody in my infantry battalion. This is back in the 90s. His name Father Dan Hall. He pulled me into his office and he gave me the whole confidence, arrogance speech. Because he went through the same thing as a young lieutenant in Vietnam, like, right? So he's like, look, learn from my mistakes. I'm like, okay. So I learned a couple lessons. One, there's a difference between arrogance and confidence, and humility is a very important trait. But I also learned that most developing leaders have that same common problem. Like they all go through that issue, right? And so I was like, okay, so as I developed my own subordinates, I had that same conversation with many of them to help them understand where that line is. And it's not a black and white line, right? But humility. Selfless. Did anybody say selfless up here? No. Okay, what's that mean? When I say selfless, what comes to your mind?
To give of yourself, put others before you.
Yep. So in the Marine Corps, officers eat last. So if you're out in the field training and they bring out like hot chow, there's never enough, just so you know. There's never enough. So if you're the company commander, you're not eating. Like there's not enough food because you have young 18, 19-year-old kids who are doing a lot of physical stuff, they are freaking hungry, right? So you let them have seconds and all that. There ain't anything left for you to eat, but that's okay, right? Like, because it's not about me, it's about them, right? I got to do what's best for them. As if we were in a defensive position in training, I always tried to make sure there was a very rigorous sleep plan. It's pretty dumb just to say, suck it up for 7 days. No, like, there's science behind if you don't have sleep, you won't perform properly, right? And so I even had to learn the hard way about being disciplined for myself to get enough rest. But I always, if I had to sacrifice, I was the one who would sacrifice, not even for my lieutenant. Like, I sacrificed for my lieutenant. So that was setting the example, all these things, right? So bias for action, and I think in your profession, like the Marine Corps, pretty dang important. Like, not a lot of time when you show up and there's smoke showing for you to contemplate for 10 minutes what you might do, right? Because the place would be burned to the ground by then, right? But if it's a technical rescue, bias for action isn't necessarily on a time scale. It's about your thought and your deliberate thought about how you might try to approach solving that problem, because that's more novel, right? And so a bias for action means your willingness to evaluate the situation you're within, make a judgment of how much time you have to act, and then take the appropriate action within that time horizon. So it's not one narrowly defined thing, but if you can't make a decision, that's the worst thing, right? That is the worst thing. And I have seen, unfortunately, both in my military experience at very senior levels, like 4-star level, all the way down to the tactical level, and I've heard anecdotes across the fire service of inaction. Inaction gets people killed. So I'm not saying blindly just do something, because that's dumb too, right? But you're a professional, and you should be prepared and have thought through a lot of these things. That's why you get raised to a position of authority and leadership to be in charge, right? But failure to act is not acceptable in my view. And so as a Marine leader, I fired people for that, both in training and in combat. In combat, only once, in training, multiple times, because training's a reflection, like, training's hard. It's way easier than combat. So if they can't get it right in training, they sure as hell aren't going to get it right in combat, right? And you're going to make choices on the fire ground, just like I made on the battlefield, that in retrospect you're going to wish that maybe you didn't make those choices because there was maybe a negative consequence. But you should always remember, what did you know at the time when you made the decision? It's easy in retrospect, just like I told you about the 9/11 Commission, to go back and say, well, you shoulda, coulda, whatever, right? Hey, at the time, what information did you know? What was your judgment of time, the scenario, right? And were you generally correct? Yes. Sometimes you can do all the things right and bad things happen. Sometimes you can do really crappy things and you have a good outcome. You should know the difference, though, right?
Make decisions with imperfect information on the fire ground.
Yes.
And sometimes you want to make decisions without hesitation or immediate reflection. Doesn't mean you don't go back and do some self-awareness and self-discovery, but there are times when you don't have time to have that hesitation. You have to make a decision.
I agree.
Life or death, right? And you may not make the right one.
Right. But I also know that you made the best decision you could in that circumstance, right? So that's how we have to judge those things. So when we're judging, I never judged my subordinate leaders on, ultimately it's about success, achieving, right? I talked about the fourth bullet of influence is about achieving, right? Achieving the mission. But if they were just lucky to achieve the mission, I also critiqued that and been like, you're really lucky. You're not a rock star. Like, that could have been really, really bad. Then I have another unit that gets in a really bad firefight and they have people injured or lost, right? And they didn't quite achieve everything, but they did phenomenal, right? So you have to distinguish. The circumstances matter. Okay, and we're going to talk about that more today. Set the example in deeds. Somebody said set the example, right? But this means in all things. On the fire ground, at home. Like, you go get a DUI off duty, that's not setting a good example as a firefighter in DC. If you get a DUI or get a possession charge, right? That's not a good reflection of your character. And if you're a captain or a battalion chief or a firefighter, right? As a peer, I would be disappointed in my peer. Like, I would also be like, well, how is it that so-and-so had a drinking problem and no one knew and no one did anything about it, right? Like there's a whole bunch of questions that come to my mind, right? Because as a Marine leader, different than you, I was responsible for my Marines 24 hours a day. So we could go on a 10-day leave period before deployment, and Oleg goes to Detroit on leave and he gets arrested. I'm in trouble. Like that's my fault because I did not inculcate in him the right behaviors and uphold the standards. Which seems crazy, right? Like he's 3,000 miles away from me. But that's how leadership works. It's about influence. The distance doesn't mean anything, right? It's about what you internalized, right? So people-oriented, like I was telling you on that wiring diagram. The DC Fire Department is people who are organized in a certain way. People are more important than hardware. People are more important than, the fire truck. And what I find humorous about this is the fire service doesn't actually believe that, in my opinion. Because we'll spend $900,000 to buy a new engine, and you all are a little bit of the exception. Oh no, we can't afford a leadership development program. I'm like, what do you mean? Like you can't afford a leadership development program? It's going to cost you, I don't know, $250,000 or $300,000 a year, but you can't directly measure it, right? Because how much did those individuals then influence the greater network? Comp time? How much were people inspired? There's all these other intangible things you can't measure, right? And the people who are giving you the money want like quantifiable sort of stuff, right? In the Marine Corps, as a Marine officer, I got commissioned. I went to training for 10 months. Then I led an infantry platoon for 3 years. Then I went to school again for 9 months. Then I led an infantry company for 2.5 years. Then you go to school again. Like professional development is part of the institutional culture. And I know that there's all these jokes about Marines eat crayons and stuff. Like Marines actually read a lot. Like reading and history and understanding who we are and why we do things is a normal part from private to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, right? And so leadership is the glue, because if leadership is culture making and if leadership is about inspiring, empowering, developing, and achieving, then that's everything. And if you believe that people is what comprises your department, then leadership is super, cool word, right? Super important, right? Okay, self-reliant. So I'll throw a couple. You all talked about technical and tactical proficiency. Disciplined, right? Discipline, and Oleg and I talked about this morning. But how do you measure whether your company is disciplined, or your battalion, or what are the things that you look for that would be indicators that it's disciplined? What's that? Okay, productivity, maybe. Because you can be lucky and be productive, right? What do you all think? What's disciplined mean? Go ahead.
Consistency.
Okay, consistency to what? To standards?
Yes.
Okay, consistency to standards. What else?
I say not taking shortcuts.
Okay, which means not following whatever the protocol is, right? Or the procedure, right? Okay. What else? How do you know if how do you judge if a company is not disciplined? So if I were to go visit, which engine company has the least calls in the district generally?
29.
Okay. All right, man, everybody, any of y'all going to 29? That's going to suck. No, I'm kidding. But that's a good opportunity if you go there because you have time to learn and train and do some other things other than just go in the fires. But if I were to go to visit, when I go and I do these sort of speaking things, I usually show up early. Like if I'm supposed to be there at 4 o'clock, I show up at like 10 o'clock in the morning, unannounced. And I'm usually in jeans and a t-shirt or shorts and flip-flops. I'm like, hey, you mind? You can show me around your station? And because I'm trying to evaluate how does that company see itself, the community that they serve, and then who's showing me? Is it the officer? Is it the driver? Or is it the brand new recruit that they have showing me around the station? How clean is it? And I ask them questions like, oh, how busy are you guys? Oh, no, we're not very, we haven't had a call in like 5 days. But the whole place looks like shit. And you're like, well, what have you been doing? Like, you haven't been fighting fire. Like, so there's not really a reason that, like, your engine bay hasn't been mopped in like a year, or that the engine is completely dirty, or I'm like, oh, I play dumb. They have no idea, right? I open up the compartments. I'm like, the axe is dull, like the tools are dirty. And you're like, you're not actually that, if you were the busiest engine company in the city, I'd be like, oh, you just came back from a fire, you're getting ready to go on another one. I get it. But like, you're not, right? And then they're wearing, so it's not one thing, it's all of those things together, right? So I don't just have one little checklist, but these are things that I ask, right? I ask them about training. I ask them about, what's your shift? So I live just north of Tampa Bay, and I have a good friend who's a captain at Tampa Bay Fire Rescue. And so I always talk to him about, talk to me about your shift and what are your firefighters doing and what's the protocol? And you're recording this, but they're not as good as they should be, for sure. I believe they're undisciplined. Whereas the county I live in, which is a new growing county fire department of about 550 firefighters, very progressive, very disciplined, learning organization. It's different, and they're literally like right next to each other, and you're like, how can it be so different? Comes back to leadership, right? Comes back to leadership as culture making. What is the culture, right? That's going to drive all of that. Okay, and then of course mission-oriented is the last one, right? That's the achieve part. Like, you can do all this, but there's a purpose behind everything that you do. You exist protecting our great republic's capital, right? And the people that live here, the property and the lives of the people that live here, right? In 1814, the British troops during the War of 1812 landed in Benedict off the Patuxent. I grew up in Calvert County, and they marched and they fought at Bladensburg. They defeated us. And then the Royal Marines marched on DC and they caught the White House on fire. They did not burn 8th and I, by the way, because the Marines gave them a good licking at Bladensburg. But so think about this. I mean, you get to work in the greatest city in the world, in my opinion. I mean, I love this city. Everybody I tell, like, Washington is just unique. And I've been all over the United States. I've been all over Europe. I've been to 40 countries. Like, I love this place. I can't afford to live here, so I live in Florida. But my point is that you exist for a reason. You have a mission. Your mission is to protect property, fight fire, respond to emergencies, and do all those things. So you're not just representing the citizens of the District of Columbia, because the U.S. Congress actually oversees the government of the district. So you are a reflection of the United States of America. Like, you are unique among all other fire departments in the United States. I don't know if you saw it that way. That's the way I see it. And I think that's pretty phenomenal.